Welcome back. We're going to have a little chat about the roadmaps that Games Workshop introduced, displayed, proudly, kind of, during the Warhammer Preview online during the Nova Open 2024. It was the stream they did at a comfortable and not at all inconvenient 2 o'clock in the morning if you're in the UK. I mean, it was a lot more reasonable if you were in the US, but still. And there's been a lot of conversation. There's been a lot of feedback. A lot of very shouty, angry, sweary feedback to these roadmaps, which, I mean, I'm not going to do that, much though I could. Instead, we're going to have a little guess as to what exactly they were going for, why it didn't work, and what I think we were all collectively expecting when it comes to Games Workshop saying, we're going to try something new, and we're going to kind of show you what's coming up in the new year, or in the near future, or even the far future. The grim darkness of the far future, perhaps. Let's start with the 40k one, right? First things first, there is useful, usable information in here. There's no real idea of timescale though, which is not unusual for Games Workshop, but it is worth pointing out that they explicitly called out Deathcore of Krieg, Eldar are getting some Aspect Warrior action, and Imperial Knights are getting something or other. They weren't particularly clear on that one. It was also like 10 past 2 in the morning, so I'll be honest, my concentration was wavering by the time they actually got to the roadmap section, but there is stuff in here that is kind of useful. Little hint, special chaos treats, obviously going to be Emperor's Children. I mean, it'd be nice if it was. I'm assuming it probably is, but I could be wrong. Some of this is useful, right? Some of this is kind of useful, but it's also useful in a non-usable way. Knowing that we're going to get Deathcore of Krieg, good. Knowing that Aspect Warriors are going to get some sort of action, good. Knowing that Imperial Knights are getting something, good. Knowing when that's going to happen would have been better, because 2025, that's quite a big chunk of time. I believe they said that Astra Militarum is going first, and then it's going to be Eldar, which does make sense, but how soon? Are we talking a month into that year, or a week into that year? We have no idea. So when it comes to them being vague on roadmaps, that's nothing new, but this one feels especially rough for that when you consider that a good half of what was on this roadmap is not actually relevant. They did a whole thing of what we've had so far. New edition of 40k. I mean, that was actually 2023, wasn't it? The new edition of 40k? Maybe I'm misremembering, but I think it was earlier than they've actually said it was here, but never mind. There was a whole kind of retrospective, here's what we've seen, here's what's come out, here's what's coming out soon. I'm going to say right now, and this applies to all of the roadmaps, the people watching the stream don't need to know that and don't care. It might sound a bit mean, it might sound a bit harsh, but that's not what people are there for. People are there for things that they haven't seen before and information on things that they are yet to see. We know what we've had. You're not watching those streams 9 times out of 10 unless you have some vague knowledge of what is going on roughly with Games Workshop, with Warhammer, be it 40k, AOS, Old World, whichever particular system you enjoy, you kind of know what's happened, especially over the last few months. So talking at length about the things that have already gone on is pretty much wasted airtime on most of your audience. Most of the audience. It was also kind of puzzling that Blood Angels are going to end out the year, so we're right on the cusp of September here, and Blood Angels is all you get for the rest of 2024. An underwhelming and slightly confusing part of an already kind of underwhelming and not all that usable roadmap. But the thing is, it wasn't just the 40k one that was like this. I mean, if we want to talk about bad roadmaps, good grief. The Horus Heresy one was absolutely useless. I'm sorry, but there's just no information here. There's just no information to really go on. There's nothing that is going to excite new players. There's nothing to really give existing players any kind of information as to what's happening. Again, we had a nice recap of the fact that the Solar Auxilia are here. We had a nice recap of the fact that the Mechanicum have shown up in plastic, which is fine, good, great. Other factions lurk, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Fine. No real indication as to what those are. And then when you get down to what to expect during 2025, something new every month and tanks. How does that help anyone? I genuinely am asking the question, how does that help anyone? Who's sitting there and going, oh, well, now I know that. That's made all the difference in terms of how I plan out what I'm going to do with my hobby, Horus Heresy-wise. The only thing that is really informational about this is something new every month, but of course that is incredibly vague, and it doesn't specify what that new thing would be, and the fact that there's going to be more Legions Imperialis, which you would expect anyway, because Legions Imperialis is taking the stuff from Horus Heresy and making it very small. They already have all the stuff they need to make the stuff for the Horus Heresy, and as such, making it small is just an extra small step after that. This isn't a roadmap, because it doesn't tell us anything. It doesn't tell us what's happening or when. There are no specifics. Now, if you've said, we're going to try something new, we're going to try showing you what's coming up, you have to actually do that. We're going to keep making things for our games. That doesn't mean anything. That's the default state. That is what we expect of Games Workshop on a rolling, regular basis, that they will update what they're doing in terms of new models, new rules. That you don't need to include that on a roadmap, because that's not specific enough. And that's exactly what this is. We're going to keep making it. Great. That helps no one. The Old World roadmap wasn't that much better, to be totally honest, and there are some interesting things on here which I just do not understand why they're on there at all. We had the same preamble, we had the same discussion of the fact that it launched, of the fact that they had these particular factions, that these factions have been announced and they're going to be on their way. Again, though, that's not what most people are watching this for. They're looking for an actual indication as to what's going to happen in the future, which we did get a bit of. Empire of Man, High Elves. Okay, 2025, we know we're getting those. More factions is fantastically vague, but I guess it does indicate that they are planning to continue supporting the Old World, which we already knew, because otherwise they wouldn't be doing Empire of Man and High Elves to begin with. And something that I completely glossed over and didn't even notice when looking at these initially last night, when I was extremely sleep deprived, is something that I may well have glossed over again if it wasn't for Liam Dempsey pointing it out, which is that there is a section on here, Army Boxes, Heroes. Plastic, metal, resin. Why are you just listing the materials that you make your miniatures out of? Why is that on a roadmap? What does that mean? What does that tell anybody? You're going to continue making the models that you already make? We know that. You've said that in the rest of the roadmap. You've said that there's going to be Empire of Man and High Elves and more factions, that nebulous, all-encompassing term. And Army Boxes and Heroes, well, that's the format that you've been supporting that game in up until this point anyway, so we'd expect that, but you've clarified that that's the case. Why are you telling us what they're made of? Why is that not present on any of the others? Presumably because most of the others don't have anything in the way of metal anymore, or very little in the way of metal anymore, and that's almost become its own selling point for the Old World, that you can get your old miniatures the way that they used to be made. Fine. Why is it there, though? Again, that's not useful information for most of the people watching. Most of the people watching who are interested in Old World, I would imagine already knew that you were making miniatures in those specific materials, because those are all the materials you use to make miniatures. If one of the things in there had said cheese, or chunks of the moon, or fallen meteorite obsidian, then we could go, oh wow, they're branching out into new materials. Plastic, metal and resin miniatures is literally your company's job. Why is that even on there? It feels like I'm being nitpicky, but in the context of we want to tell you what's coming up, that feels like something that is added in to pad out. Like, it really does. It feels like, well, we can't just have a thing that says Army Boxes and Heroes, even though that is in there. We need to indicate what they're made of as well. It doesn't say plastic or resin under Horus Heresy and like plastic under the 40k one anywhere. Why put it in the Old World? And why specify it to that degree when we already know that that's what you make your miniatures from? It's a baffling inclusion. It just doesn't need to be there. Along with, it's worth pointing out, all the so far stuff. Because once again, we already knew about all of this. Because if we're watching it, the chances are we're interested and have some idea of the fact that, I mean, in the case of the Old World, it exists. This was a 2024 launch. It was not that long ago. We don't need the recap. We know this. We don't need to see the road where we came from, we want to see the road ahead of us. And whilst we did get a bit of that here, again, there's a whole lot of just stuff that we already knew, followed by little tiny glimpses of stuff that would have been really useful to know more of. Finally, the AOS roadmap is, again, more of the same. And you obviously were expecting that, because that's just how this has worked this entire time. For each one of these roadmaps, it's been a heavy dose of retrospection, some of it not particularly retrospective in terms of how far back you've looked, because of course AOS 4.0 dropped a couple of months ago. So in this case it felt especially egregious. Still to come, we already knew we were getting more Skaven, we already knew we were getting more Stormcast Eternals. That was the subject of part of the preview stream, was Stormcast Eternals. Slaves to Darkness, that is useful information. But then going into 2025, we actually have some useful proper information here. Spearhead. We're getting Spearhead boxes for the Orruk War Clans and for the Gloomspite Gits. That's good information, that's good to know. Death, more to be announced soon. I mean, it could be any one of the sub-factions under the Death Grand Alliance. That they're not really calling them Grand... It's not really Grand Alliances anymore, but whatever. Again, the clarification of army boxes and spearheads, kind of unnecessary, but also indicates that they are continuing to support Spearhead. So that is something. But again, it felt like a chunk of this was stuff you already know, stuff you have just seen, and here's a few concretes, and then nothing else particularly helpful. Now, having gone through all of those again now with you guys, I'm just struggling to work out who this was for, because I don't know. I don't know who Games Workshop was aiming this at. I don't know what audience was supposed to consume it, because I don't think it was the audience that saw it last night. I mean, the amount of new information in these roadmaps was outweighed by the amount of old information. And given that, again, I really think that these preview shows are mostly watched by the people who are most heavily invested in the models and in the games themselves, they are not going to be, like, blown away by being told stuff they already know. They are going to be blown away by a roadmap that gives them a clear indication as to what's coming up in the future, which we also didn't really get. In some situations, we did get some good information. The AOS one, at least we know spearheads are on the way for 2 factions. That's something, but of course there's no idea of timescale. There never is with the roadmaps, but especially... Well, actually that's not true. They have done slightly better with it before. The 40k one, again, we did have some useful information, but there was also a whole lot of information that we already knew, and no one watching was sat there going, oh, I had no idea that you'd just done a big Blood Angels update. Because you're very good at marketing. If there's one thing to be said for you, Games Workshop, you're very, very good at marketing. We know when you bring stuff out. It is impossible to avoid. I mean, I am 100% complicit in that because I make videos about it. But with that context, did you really think that people watching didn't know? Because they did. In the case of things like the Horus Heresy one, I genuinely don't know why you bothered. Like, I actually don't know why that was even part of the presentation, or why the graphic for it exists. I genuinely don't know why they even included this. And I'm saying that as somebody who loves tanks. Like, I love tanks. Look at all the tanks. I'm a big fan of tanks. But this is genuinely worthless. I think the problem is that not only do I not know who they were aiming for with this particular presentation, I'm not sure they know who they were aiming for. I don't think they had a clear idea as to what they were doing or why they were doing it, other than they needed to give us something. And giving us something is better than staying silent, but having an idea as to what you're going to do with that information, how much information you've got, and what people will want to know is important. It's very important. And it feels like a lot of that was just missing this time around. This, as an idea, is good. Giving us a roadmap as to what's happening towards the end of the year into the next year, that's actually quite a good idea. The execution of it was not good. The execution of it was kind of baffling and left a lot of people feeling as though they just didn't get anything usable. And that's the opposite of what you want from kind of trying something whereby you give people information. If more information just leads to confusion, that means you've done a bad job with the information. And that's kind of what's happened here. I don't know who this was for. I genuinely don't. Because it doesn't feel like it was for us. but I also don't know who else they would even aim it at. I think this is one of those rare situations where it requires so much improvement that it might as well be a different thing. The information that was supplied was not well thought out. The information that we already had was completely superfluous because we already had it. The fact that it took longer to discuss what we'd already had versus what we were going to get is extremely optimistic when it comes to the audience who watch those shows. I'm including myself in that, by the way. I really get excited about new stuff, and being told here's a bunch of new stuff to think about and look forward to, oh, by the way, here's a bunch of old stuff first, it sets expectations the wrong way. There is most likely a version of this that works and is satisfying as a viewer and as a customer and leaves you knowing at least vaguely what's happening and gets you excited for it, but this wasn't it. This wasn't it.